The Unbreakable Hunter. Chapter 1. The Caged Monster. The ramp of the Krell dropship hissed open, venting a cloud of recycled air that was instantly swallowed by the screaming sub-zero winds of Cositus 4. Nolan Aris felt a massive, scaly hand shove him forward. He stumbled, his bare feet hitting the crystalline snow. The cold was an immediate physical blow, like being struck by a frozen hammer. He fell to his knees, gasping as the thin, frigid air burned his lungs. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. Around him, the gravity of the moon, 40% stronger than Earth's, tugged at his bones, making his muscles ache with a sudden, leaden weight.
"Look at it! Shivering! Fragile!"
hissed Commander Vaxus, his 4 powerful arms crossed over his iridescent green chest plate. The Krell stood 7 feet tall, his lidless eyes glowing with a predatory yellow light. He looked down at Nolan with a mixture of amusement and utter contempt.
"You're making a mistake. You don't know what we are,"
Nolan whispered, his teeth already beginning to chatter. He forced himself to look up, squinting against the blinding white glare of the moon's surface. His gray eyes were bloodshot, but steady.
"We know exactly what you are, human. You are lunch. You are the soft-skinned weaklings of the galaxy. No claws, no scales, no venom."
Vaxus laughed, a dry, rasping sound like sandpaper on stone. He gestured to the vast, jagged ice fields that stretched toward the horizon, where frozen mountains pierced the purple sky like broken teeth.
"We give you the mercy of an hour. Run, little mammal. Try to find a hole to die in. The hunt begins when the first sun sets,"
the alien commander added, tapping the high-tech heater unit strapped to his thigh. To a Krell, cold was the ultimate enemy, a biological death sentence. They relied on their technology to keep their reptilian blood from turning to slush. They couldn't conceive of a creature that could generate its own heat from the inside.
1 hour. That's more than I need,"
Nolan said, his voice gaining a strange, rhythmic calm. He stood up slowly, fighting the crushing gravity. His knees popped and his muscles burned, but he didn't falter. He wasn't looking for a place to hide. He was looking at the terrain, mapping the slopes, the wind direction, and the density of the snow. He was a marathoner. He didn't see a wasteland. He saw a track. Vaxus sneered, turning back toward the warmth of his ship. He didn't notice the way Nolan began to breathe, deep, measured inhalations that synchronized with his heartbeat. Nolan didn't bolt in a panicked sprint. He didn't waste energy on a desperate burst of speed. Instead, he started to trot, a steady, mechanical pace, 8 miles per hour. Foot after foot, the rhythmic thud of his heels in the snow became a metronome. The Krell scouts watched from the ramp, clicking their mandibles in mockery. They saw a pathetic, shivering creature limping into the white void. They didn't understand the chemistry occurring inside Nolan's body. They didn't see the way his thyroid was already ramping up, the way his core temperature was stabilizing, or how his mind was entering the zone, that hallowed, terrifying space where pain becomes background noise and the only thing that exists is the next step. As Nolan disappeared into the swirling snow, he felt the old, ancestral hunger waking up in his marrow. For millions of years, his ancestors hadn't been the fastest, or the strongest, or the most well-armed. They had simply been the ones who never stopped. They were the persistence hunters of the savannah. They had run mammoths into exhaustion and chased deer until the animals' hearts literally exploded from stress.
"Just keep moving. Left, right, breathe. Left, right, breathe,"
he muttered to himself, his internal monologue becoming a mantra. The wind tore at his thin thermal layer, and the frost began to nip at his ears, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. If he stopped, the cold would claim him. If he ran too fast, he would burn out. He had to be the perfect machine. Back at the ship, Vaxus checked his chronometer, a cruel smile spreading across his snout. He signaled his squad to prepare their skiffs and thermal lances. He expected a short game, a frantic chase, a cornered animal, and a quick kill. He had no idea that for the first time in his life, he wasn't the hunter. He had just started a race against a creature that was designed by 3 billion years of evolution to never, ever finish second. Chapter 2. The Cold Equation. The hunt officially began when the first of Cocytus IV's twin suns dipped below the jagged horizon, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the ice. The air temperature plummeted another 20 degrees in minutes, turning the moisture in the air into falling needles of frost. Commander Vaxus climbed into his hovering interception skiff, the vehicle's repulsors kicking up a cloud of glittering ice dust.
Deploy the thermal seekers. I want to see his pulse fluttering before we strike.
Vaxus commanded, his voice booming over the roar of the engines. His 2 elite scouts, Krell and Zal, mounted their own sleek gravity bikes. They were armed with kinetic lances and thermal tracking goggles. To them, this was a celebration, a victory lap before the kill.
Target located. Coordinates calculated. Distance, 12 kilometers.
The skiff's computer chimed in a cold, synthetic drone. Vaxus paused, his yellow eyes narrowing as he stared at the glowing holographic display.
12 kilometers. That is impossible. Check for system errors.
He snapped. The gravity of this moon was nearly 1.5 times that of the human's home world. To cover 12 kilometers of broken, icy terrain in 60 minutes would require a constant, punishing speed. A Krell warrior could do it, but they would be panting, their muscles gorged with lactic acid, needing an hour of rest afterward.
No error. Target is moving at a constant velocity, 8 miles per hour, non-stop.
The AI responded. Vaxus hissed, a sound of irritation. He pushed the throttle forward, and the skiff screamed across the tundra, leaving a trail of scorched ozone. Miles away, Nolan Aris was no longer a man. He was a biological machine. His world had narrowed down to the 3 feet of snow directly in front of him. Crunch, crunch, breathe, crunch, crunch, breathe. His lungs were raw, the cold air stripping the moisture from his throat, but his body was deceptively warm. Inside his thermal layer, he was drenched in sweat. His heart was a steady drum, beating at a controlled 140 beats per minute. This was the sweet spot, the pace where he could burn fat and oxygen indefinitely.
Come on, Nolan, just a Tuesday morning run. Just a long haul. Don't look back.
He whispered to himself, his voice a raspy croak. He felt a sharp sting in his calf. A jagged piece of razor ice had sliced through his leggings. He didn't stop to check the wound. He felt the warm trickle of blood, but he knew the cold would soon clot it. He used the pain as a focal point, a tiny spark of heat to keep his mind sharp. Suddenly, the sky behind him lit up with the blue glow of Krell engines. The hunters were close. Nolan didn't panic. He didn't speed up. Instead, he steered his path toward the glass canyons, a labyrinth of towering ice pillars where the moon's magnetic field was at its strongest. Vaxus's skiff suddenly lurched. The holographic display flickered and died, replaced by a burst of static. The high-pitched whine of the engines dropped into a growling vibration.
What is happening? Why are the shields dropping?
Vaxus yelled, slamming his hand against the console.
Warning. Magnetic interference. Power cells depleting. Ambient temperature is draining battery efficiency.
The AI warned. The Krell technology, elegant and hyper-advanced, was designed for controlled environments. In the raw, chaotic energy of a death-world blizzard, it was starting to fail. The extreme cold was slowing the chemical reactions in their power cells, the same way it would slow a Krell's blood.
Land the craft! We proceed on foot! He cannot be far!
Vaxus ordered. The three Krell leapt from their failing vehicles, their heavy boots thudding into the snow. They found the spot where Nolan had been minutes before. Krell, the scout, pointed at a dark stain in the white powder.
Blood! He is wounded! He is weakening!
The scout hissed, his long tongue flicking out to taste the air. He looked ahead, expecting to see a slumped figure in the distance. Instead, he saw only the endless, rhythmic line of footprints leading straight into the heart of the glass canyons. There were no signs of stumbling, no places where the human had sat down to rest. Just a straight, terrifyingly consistent line. Vaxus looked at his own hand. It was trembling, not from fear, but from the first creeping touch of the cold. His internal heater was struggling to keep up with the moon's hunger. He looked at the human's tracks again. The realization began to dawn on him. A cold weight in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. The human wasn't running to find a hole to die in. He was running to lead them away from the warmth of their ship. He was leading them into a place where their technology wouldn't matter.
That's it. Keep following me. Come and see what a Death Worlder looks like when he's just getting started.
Nolan thought, his mind sensing the vibration of the Krell boots behind him. He didn't feel like prey anymore. He felt like the wind. He felt like the ice. He felt like the inevitable end of the hunt. Chapter 3. The Shivering Superiority. The glass canyons were a nightmare of jagged obsidian ice and shimmering quartz, reflecting the moonlight in a way that made distance impossible to judge. Nolan Aris moved through the maze like a ghost, his breathing now a heavy rhythmic rasp. Every joint in his body screamed. The 1.5G gravity felt like an invisible giant was standing on his shoulders, trying to crush him into the permafrost. His improvised furs, stripped from a local wool beast he'd found dead earlier, were stiff with frozen sweat and rime.
Mile 22, just a marathon, only the gravity was a bitch.
Nolan wheezed, his voice barely a vibration in the thin air. He felt the vibration of a heavy footfall behind him. A single set of tracks. One of the scouts had broken formation, driven by the Krell bloodlust to claim the kill before the others. Behind him, Krell the scout was a vision of agony. The Krell was built for explosive speed, short, lethal bursts of violence. But he had been running for 3 hours now. His primary lungs were burning, and his secondary air sacs were pulsing spasmodically against his ribs. His iridescent scales had lost their luster, turning a dull, sickly gray as his internal temperature plummeted.
Halt, weakling! I command! You!
Krell roared, though it sounded more like a wet cough. He lunged forward, his forearms outstretched to grab Nolan's throat. He was faster than a human, even now, but his movements were clumsy, his coordination frayed by the onset of hypothermia. Nolan didn't run away. He didn't even flinch. As the 7-foot alien bore down on him, Nolan simply planted his lead foot and pivoted. It was a simple movement, a wrestler's shunt, but in this gravity, momentum was a lethal weapon. He caught Krell's leading arm, used the scout's own massive weight against him, and stepped into the alien's center of gravity. With a grunt of pure exertion, Nolan sent the scout flying. Krell hit an ice pillar with a sickening crack, his thermal heater shattering against the crystal surface. The alien slumped into the snow, his limbs twitching feebly.
You're out of breath, big guy. On my world, we don't stop until the sun comes up,
Nolan said, standing over him. He was shivering violently, a biological defense mechanism to generate heat, but his eyes were clear. He looked at the broken heater on the alien's belt. It sparked once and died.
How? You are not dead. It is negative 60.
Krell hissed, his mandibles clicking in a slow, rhythmic death knell. He watched in horror as steam actually rose from the human's bare neck. Nolan's skin was bright red, his metabolism working at 300% efficiency to keep his blood liquid. Suddenly, the wind changed. The low moan of the canyons turned into a high-pitched shriek. A white-out blizzard, the legendary Scythe of Cocytus, was descending. The sky vanished, replaced by a wall of swirling razor-sharp ice crystals that reduced visibility to 0.
Critical alert. External temperature dropping to lethal levels. System failure imminent.
A distant voice echoed from Krell's fallen comm unit. It was Vaxus, somewhere back in the dark, his own voice distorted by the storm and the failing tech. Nolan didn't stay to watch the scout freeze. He couldn't afford the sentiment. He knelt down, stripped a small emergency flare from the scout's belt, and turned back into the white abyss. He knew that if he stopped now, the sweat in his clothes would turn to ice and kill him in minutes. He had to keep his heart rate up. He had to keep the engine running. The blizzard was a physical weight. It hammered at Nolan, trying to push him over, trying to bury him. He closed his eyes, navigating by the slant of the wind and the slope of the ground. He was back on the trails of the Sierra Nevada, back in the ultramarathons of his youth. He counted his steps. 1, 2, 3, 4.
The Krell, they're cold-blooded. They're cells. They just stop. But I'm a furnace. I'm a goddamn walking campfire.
He hallucinated, a delirious smile touching his cracked lips. He could feel his fat reserves melting away, his body consuming itself to stay alive. It was a terrifying, beautiful biological trade-off. Miles behind him, Commander Vaxus stood over the frozen corpse of his second scout, Zal. The scout hadn't been killed by a weapon. He had simply sat down, his heart unable to pump the thickened blood through his veins. Vaxus's own heater was whining, its light turning from green to a desperate, flickering red. He looked into the blizzard, into the direction the human had gone.
He is not an animal. He is a malignant force. Why does he not fall?
Vaxus screamed into the wind, his 4 hands clenching into useless fists. For the first time in the history of the Krell Empire, an apex seeker felt the cold, primal bite of being the prey. The human wasn't just surviving the death world. The human was using it. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Blizzard. The world was no longer made of rock and ice. It was a screaming void of white noise and horizontal needles. Commander Vaxus stumbled through the drifts, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. His 2 upper arms were tucked tight against his chest, trying to preserve what little heat remained in his core. The light on his thigh-mounted heater was no longer flickering. It was a steady, dying ember.
Where are you, demon? Show yourself.
Vaxus roared, his voice thin and reedy against the gale. He swung his kinetic lance blindly into the whiteout. He was hallucinating. He saw the human's shadow in every jagged pillar of ice, every swirling eddy of snow. But every time he lunged, there was nothing but the mocking whistle of the wind. A sharp thwack echoed to his left. A stone, heavy and precise, struck the side of his helmet. Vaxus spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird.
I see you. I will tear the flesh from your weak bones.
He screamed, firing a bolt of kinetic energy into the mist. The blast shattered an ice formation, sending a spray of crystal shards into the air, but no human body fell. Instead, another rock struck his shoulder from the opposite direction. Then another hit his leg. Nolan Aris was barely 50 feet away, crouched behind a ridge of frost-shattered basalt. To Vaxus, Nolan was a ghost. To Nolan, the world had become a series of tactical calculations. His vision was tunneling, his peripherals darkening as his brain diverted every ounce of energy to his heart and legs. He was in the black zone, the place where the body stops asking for permission and starts operating on ancient lizard brain survival protocols.
Keep him spinning, keep him moving. If he stops to rest, his blood will freeze. Don't let him close his eyes.
Nolan's internal voice was a ragged whisper, a ghost of his former self. He was starving, his body having long since burned through its glucose and moved on to consuming his own muscle tissue for fuel. His hands were numb, his fingers feeling like wooden pegs, but he could still throw. He could still move. Vaxus tried to sit down, his legs finally giving out under the oppressive 1.5 G gravity. The Krell's biology was shutting down. His thoughts were becoming sluggish, like honey in a freezer. He just wanted to sleep. He just wanted the shivering to stop. Crack! A rock the size of a fist shattered the visor of Vaxus's helmet, grazing his snout. The pain was a cold jolt of adrenaline that forced him back to his feet.
Get up, Apex. I'm not done with you yet.
Nolan hissed from the shadows. He didn't sound like a man anymore. His voice was a dry, rasping growl that seemed to come from the ice itself. He was using the oldest trick in the human playbook, the pursuit predator's psychological siege. He wasn't just chasing Vaxus, he was denying him the mercy of a quiet death.
Why? You are dying, too. I can smell the frostbite.
Vaxus pleaded, his arrogance completely shattered. He looked at his own 4 hands. They were turning a translucent, frozen blue. The Krell, the masters of 1,000 worlds, were being dismantled by a creature that refused to accept the logic of the cold. Nolan didn't answer. He couldn't. Speech required too much oxygen. He simply stepped out of the whiteout for a brief second, a gaunt, terrifying figure shrouded in frost, his eyes glowing with a feral, unbreakable light. He looked less like a colonist and more like a vengeful spirit of the tundra. Then, with a flicker of movement, he vanished back into the storm. Vaxus began to weep, the tears freezing instantly into pearls of ice on his scales. He realized the horrifying truth of the endurance vibe the Krell had ignored in their archives. Humans didn't win because they were stronger. They won because they were the only species in the galaxy crazy enough to find a rhythm in the agony.
Warning! Heater unit depleted. System shut down.
The AI whispered in Vaxus's ear, sounding almost apologetic. The amber light went black. The silence of the moon rushed in, absolute and lethal. Vaxus took one stumbling step, then another, his forearms flailing for a grip on a world that no longer belonged to him. Behind him, the rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch of Nolan's footsteps continued, steady, inevitable, and infinite. Chapter 5. The Last Breath. The storm finally broke at dawn. The screaming winds died down to a low, mournful whistle, leaving the surface of Cocytus IV buried under 3 feet of fresh, crystalline powder. The sky turned a pale, sickly green as the twin suns began their ascent. In a shallow depression between 2 frozen ridges, Commander Vaxus lay perfectly still. His once vibrant green scales were now coated in a thick layer of frost, turning him into a macabre statue of ice. His 4 arms were curled tightly around his torso in a final futile attempt to protect the heat of his heart.
Is it over?
Vaxus's thoughts were a dim flicker, like a dying candle in a vast, dark hall. He couldn't feel his legs. He couldn't feel the sting of the air. He felt only a heavy, velvet-like weight pulling him down into the snow. He opened his lidless eyes just a crack. his vision blurred by frozen moisture. A shadow fell over him. It was a tall, jagged silhouette against the rising suns. For a moment, Vaxus thought it was the grim reaper of Krell legend. But then he heard it. The sound that had haunted his dreams for the last 12 hours. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Nolan Aris stood over him. The human looked like a corpse that had refused to stay buried. His face was a mask of blackened frostbite and dried blood. His lips were cracked and blue. His breath came in shallow, ragged bursts of steam that rose into the air like ghost smoke. He was gaunt, his ribs visible through his shredded thermal layer, his body having consumed nearly every gram of fat and a significant portion of his own muscle to keep his core alive.
Still here,
Nolan whispered. The words were barely a croak, stripped of all emotion except a cold, terrifying clarity. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't need one. He simply stood there, a living testament to the fact that he had outlasted the apex predator of the galaxy.
How are you standing? Your heart should have stopped miles ago.
Vaxus's voice didn't come out. It was merely a desperate vibration in his throat. He looked at the human's feet. Nolan was standing on bare, blackened toes where his boots had frozen through. The human should have been in shock. He should have been dead. Nolan didn't answer. He didn't have the strength left for explanations. He simply looked down at the Krell commander with a strange, hollow pity. He had seen this before on Earth. Animals that were faster and stronger than men. Animals that could kill a human in a heartbeat if they caught them. But they never understood the hunt. They never understood that the human doesn't win in the first minute. He wins in the 10th hour. Nolan sat down in the snow, just a few feet away. He didn't close his eyes. He watched as the light faded from Vaxus's yellow pupils. He watched as the Krell's third and final heart gave one last sluggish thump, and then went silent. The apex seeker was gone, defeated not by a blade, but by a creature that was too stubborn to lie down and die. High above, the roar of heavy thrusters shattered the morning silence. A Terran Colonial Union recovery ship, alerted by Nolan's emergency flare from the Scout's belt, descended through the atmosphere. The ship's landing lights cut through the pale green dawn.
We have a heat signature, Sector 7! Medical teams deploy now!
A woman's voice crackled over the ship's external speakers. The ramp dropped before the ship had even fully settled, and 3 medics in heavy environmental suits sprinted across the ice. They found Nolan sitting upright. His eyes were open, staring at the horizon, but they were glazed and unfocused. When the lead medic, Sarah, reached him and checked his pulse, she gasped.
God, he's in a deep coma. His core temp is 84 degrees. He shouldn't even be conscious.
She shouted, her voice trembling with disbelief. As they lifted him onto the anti-grav stretcher, Nolan's legs continued to twitch in a rhythmic walking motion. His body was still trying to cover the miles. His nervous system refused to accept that the race was over. Weeks later, back on the hub station Verity, the Krell High Command received the final report of the hunt on Casitas 4. They watched the drone footage of the human's tracks, a single, unwavering line across 100 miles of lethal terrain. They looked at the autopsy of Commander Vaxus, which listed the cause of death as systemic failure due to exhaustion and hypothermia. The narrator's voice, a historian of the Galactic Council, filled the debriefing room. Most species in the galaxy evolved to be the fastest, the strongest, or the smartest. We built shields to protect our bodies and lasers to extend our reach. We assumed that power was a matter of output. We were wrong. The humans are from a Class 12 death world. On Earth, the cheetah is faster. The lion is stronger. The snake is more venomous. But the human is the only one who can keep going until the sun goes down and the moon comes up. They are the galaxy's only true persistence predators. They don't need to be better than you for 5 minutes. They just need to be there when you get tired. And as the footage showed Nolan Aris walking through a blizzard that should have been his grave, the Krell Empire came to a silent, terrifying agreement. They would never hunt a human again. Because if you start a race with a Terran, you only have 2 choices. You keep running until your heart explodes, or you wait for them to arrive. And they always arrive.